I'll hand over now to Sue Lees to introduce today's speaker. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. So Charlotte Sterrett is the Yarra Riverkeeper. So the Yarra Riverkeeper is a community organisation that tackles the ecological risks that have had or could have a devastating impact on the Yarra, or the Birrarung as its Indigenous name is used quite widely now. With community support, they aim to protect the Yarra and to keep it healthy. Yarra Riverkeepers is a member of the International Waterkeeper movement of community groups caring for local waterways. So Charlotte's got a really interesting background. She's been involved for over 20 years in climate and environmental justice here in Australia and overseas. She's recognised globally for her work in Southern Africa, supporting local communities, and also in, I think, other places in the Asia Pacific region. She's supported communities to build their resistance to climate change. She is a strong advocate of community-based approaches, and she's had senior roles at Oxfam and World Vision, and I think correctly, at one stage, Charlotte, you were the Climate Action and Resilience Manager at World Vision, so a wealth of knowledge and experience in how to deal with issues of climate and the environment. So thank you very much, Charlotte, for doing this today, particularly as I realise it's your week off.
No problem, Sue. Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me just share my screen, and then we'll get started. Can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah. All right. Excellent. All right. So I feel like you might have already done a presentation like this. So but anyway, we'll see how we go, and then you can always ask questions. So yeah, as Sue mentioned, I've worked on climate change for about 20 years, and the intersection of climate and gender justice is really important, as is, well, I see climate as being a justice issue, so it tends to intersect with all the other issues of justice, whether it's gender or racial justice, etc. So I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting, well, I'm on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land out in Warrandyte in Melbourne. I live on the next to the Birrarung, which is the Yarra, as it's known as well. And just to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their continuing connection to country since time began. What I wanted to say is that, why do we need gender and climate justice? I guess everyone would have seen the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been around a little while now, and they took over from the Millennium Development Goals, and there's 17 of those, and there is a specific one on climate action, which is number 13, and then there's specific actions on gender equality as well. But if you look at all 17 goals, you'll see that there is a lot of intersection in terms of zero hunger. Obviously, food security and climate is really important. Life on land, life below water, everything is kind of integrated with climate change and gender as well. And you've got number 10, which is reduced inequalities. So it's all, although they're separate goals, you have to really look at the full picture. And we can't solve the climate crisis without addressing gender injustice. And that's sort of the work that I've been focused on. I have worked internationally for 20 years and decided to do something more local. So I probably have less to do with the gender justice work now. And that's because while women are more affected by climate change than men or gender diverse people, in Melbourne, you don't tend to see that as much. People tend to be much more wealthy. So here is some facts about gender gaps and climate impacts, and then the impacts that exacerbate gender inequalities. So you probably already know some of these facts, you know, that over 50% of the 1.5 billion people living on $1 a day or less are women. Water, you know, water is life. On average, women and children spend 8 or more hours per day collecting water. Globally, women are 16.7% of government ministers, 19.5% of parliamentarians, and 9% of heads of state. So women are really underrepresented in decision making, which means that the decisions that are made don't necessarily have the best outcomes for them. We know that women produce over 60% of food in some countries, particularly in Africa. Women really drive agriculture around the world. And in terms of literacy, 2/3 of the 774 million illiterate adults worldwide are women, and women only own 2% of the world's land. So in terms of gender gaps, there's huge issues, and things are improving in lots of countries, which is great. I know we always talk about the bad news, but in terms of climate change, if you add climate change on top of existing gender gaps, things like crop failure, fuel shortages, water scarcity, natural disasters. Well, I don't think you can say any disaster is natural. There are natural hazards, but disasters are not natural. Disease, displacement, and conflict. Women are really at the forefront of that. So in some of the countries I've worked in, women really are affected by crop failure. They do a lot of the hands-on work on the fields, and they're also responsible for household food production burden. So when crops fail or when there's less food around, women tend to go without, and girls as well. We know that with deforestation, fuel shortages is increasing as well, and women are usually responsible for collecting that wood. And what does also happen is they experience gender-based violence while they're collecting wood and water, depending on where they are. We know that women tend to die more when there's a disaster. Women are less able to swim, for example. They're usually at home caring. And then after disasters, when there's responses there, they have an increased threat of sexual violence. I saw that when I worked in Vanuatu after Cyclone Pam. And then they're the carers at home. So when there is disease in the home, they are really the ones looking after everybody. In terms of displacement, forced migration means that when women are away from home, or their partners, husbands are away from home, they're also more at risk. And then while men are more likely to be injured while fighting, women, suffer greatly from other consequences of conflict, gender-based violence being number one there. So basically what this says, and you already know this, is that women are at the front lines of climate change, which is really problematic. But what's good is that we do have opportunities to advance gender justice, as well as if we make the right decisions while we're advancing climate justice as well. We've already kind of talked about this. I just want to talk a little bit about the lady on the right here. And I worked with her in Vanuatu, and she was a formidable woman, and she helped set up some of the work that we did with Oxfam around climate action. So she's part of the setting up the Vanuatu Climate Action Network and the Vanuatu Humanitarian Team, which was interesting because it happened before Cyclone Pam. So Vanuatu was well placed. Her name is Shirley, by the way. Even though she was a leader, she also suffered as well because of being a woman, and being a poorer woman as well. And really the answer, the reason why that is because of injustice. So she was a member of a single-headed household and is poor. Many women have lack of access to and control of environmental goods and services. So while they might be the ones working in the fields, they're not the ones making the decisions about where that money goes. As we said before, they not participating in decision making and leadership. So the decisions that are made don't necessarily help them. And then they have this this workload. I've worked a lot on gender programs internationally, and sometimes the work was really well intentioned, but actually added to women's burden in terms of their workload, which is an important one to think about. That if you're trying to create more income opportunities for women, that doesn't take away the work that they have to do at home generally. So it just adds to that. Gender roles and relations, they take a really long time to change. Again, when I worked in the Pacific, we had a lot of women-led disaster management, local disaster management teams, and it took a long time for the men to respect those women, but they did over time. And then they're ignored in developing solutions. So we talked about that before. I wanted to highlight here, and sorry, I'm just getting a piece of paper out, that there are many female leaders around the world, and these are some of the young ones. I guess quite often we've heard about Greta Thunberg, but there are many other young leaders around the world, Indigenous leaders in particular, who are doing their part for the environment. But I just wanted, as women, or women here, I think we're all women here, to ask yourself these questions. Is are you a woman? Sorry, I'm trying to move the people's faces over. Are you a woman? Are you a girl? Are you non-binary? Are you poor? Are you educated? Do you have a stable job, income? So the idea behind this is that issues around vulnerability to climate change as a woman or a non-binary person are always based on other things as well. So I suspect all the ladies on the call here are probably pretty wealthy, maybe even in the 1% of wealth around the world. So really, we're very fortunate. If you're an Indigenous person or an ethnic minority, if you're a woman in a single-headed household, if you're poor, if you have a disability, if you're not educated, you're going to be much more affected by climate change than I am, or probably the people on this call are. So it's very intersectional. So the poorest of the poor, the most disadvantaged, tend to be more affected by climate change, and that's also women. For us in Australia, we do get to participate in decision making at multiple levels. We've got a by-election here next Saturday for our state member of parliament. So we'll all get to participate in that decision making. And our voice is generally more listened to. I've worked in lots of countries where women aren't able to participate in decision making. In the Pacific Islands that I've worked in, they have men's huts. They're not called that, but that's the kind of the rough translation, and that's where all the decision making happens. So women aren't even allowed in those places. So that is changing, but it takes a really long time. So based on how you answer these questions determines how you're impacted by climate change. This slide is really about women as climate champions. So flipping it on its head to saying, yes, women are more vulnerable, women are more affected. However, when you put women in positions of power or in positions of decisions, there are much better outcomes for everybody. So when women benefit, societies win, and we've seen that economically and environmentally as well. Women are great leaders economically. I've been involved in lots of programs where women have set up their own micro businesses, or they've done micro loans, and the sorts of things they're successful in those businesses, but the sorts of things they want to spend their money on is generally related to education of their children. And in Climate Drawdown, I think most people have read that book or know about that movement, and they ranked all of the different things you could do to reduce climate change, to draw down emissions. And the number one thing is to educate girls, which is quite fascinating, because people automatically assume it means, reducing, renewable energy, or, stopping deforestation, and all those things are definitely right up there. But the best thing that we can do to reduce climate is to educate girls. And part of that, yes, is around population and having less children, but there are other benefits as well. We know that women turn knowledge into action. I've seen that on the ground in many places. In Vietnam, where I've worked, women are constantly wanting to learn, and they have the solutions, and women are powerful organisers as well. And lastly, that women are better leaders in times of crisis. So they're just really great at multitasking as well. So so I'm just checking my time. So what can we do? And I've kept this presentation short because I want us to have a good time to have some discussions. But on the right, you can see that there's 9 squares there that talk about what we can do, and some of these are more systemic and generic and than others. But if I can just read through them, is consistently challenge our assumptions and inequalities. So constantly ask questions, share leadership and power, create inclusive and participatory spaces. So we do that all the time. So it's even making sure when I've been working on different programs overseas, is when we do evaluations or we're developing a program, we make sure there's safe places for women and girls to participate through focus group discussions. Because if you have a lot of women mixed in with men, quite often the women won't speak. You won't get to hear what's going on. So we divide them up and then still bring them together. We have individual interviews, one-on-ones with women by themselves, and also have different age groups as well, because sometimes there's issues between the younger people and the older people in terms of hierarchy. So there's a whole layer of culture that sits over the top of that. Taking a strength-based approach, working out not just where the vulnerabilities are, but where the capacities are, and using those strengths and getting people with diverse skills, being authentic, caring for yourself and others. So I work with this lady in Australia, Charlie, and she'd worked with 350.org and now with Tipping Point, but really, really selfless, but, you know, ended up getting burnt out and having to take quite some time out. So being able to care for ourselves and others, recognizing that the climate crisis is a long-term crisis. I mean, I guess when I started working on it 20 years ago, I mean, I still work hard now, but back then you kind of feel like everything's urgent and you have to get it done straight away. And yes, that's true, but you have to be in it for the long haul. Taking that goes hand in hand with taking time to learn and reflect, having courage and having zero tolerance for any type of violence. So on the left, these are my kind of more practical actions, is to I've worked in lots of organizations that and we talk about this a lot more now, but it used to be if you wanted to get ahead, you had to kind of become more masculine or adopt those sorts of traditional leadership styles. But I would say now it's much more obvious and acceptable to reject that traditional leadership based on competition and greed and work more collaboratively. I see that all the time now, and it really, really works. And it works not only for gender justice, but for climate justice, because we know capitalism has well, we know the greed of few hasn't led to the wealth of many, and it's certainly not helped the planet. So if we can reject that competition and greed, then we're going to be able to work in a much more collaborative way. And that leads to, you know, embracing leadership that is based on connection and collaboration. And that helps with innovation as well, if there's a safe place for people to discuss ideas. In my current role as the Yarra Riverkeeper, that's really at the heart of the work that we do, recognizing that we need to have a collective impact and that one organization or one group of people can't do it all alone. Increasing diversity and inclusion. So that's really important. I'd say the environmental movement is still very much dominated by white people, but there is a lot of change in Australia, particularly around, and the Voice to Parliament would be part of that, but traditionally around traditional owners and understanding care of country and what that means, and bringing that into the more dominant paradigm. Some examples of that, I've just come back from Darwin, and you know, cultural burning or cool burning, they're different, but the cool burning, that's just a regular accepted way of going about things, and you just travel through country and they burn off all the time. So that's one area where they've really taken that knowledge and run with it. developing feminist principles at work. So when I worked at Oxfam, so when was it, 2017, the last time I worked there, there was a big scandal in Haiti where Oxfam GB workers were found to have engaged in sex work, and I think there was some sexual abuse as well of people after Haiti earthquake. And Oxfam really were in the headlines. And then, you know, since then we've had other organisations, including the UN. There's been lots of discussion about that. So Oxfam really revolutionised the way they work. And one of the things they did was kind of strip everything back and develop these feminist principles at work. And some of the things in here on the right are examples of that. But it really helped. I think before then, people talked about Oxfam being all about gender equality, but people weren't walking the talk. And so I think that's really important. I've done that. Even a small organization can have their own feminist principles, and it's not to be mixed up with women's principles. A lot of people used to say, oh, well, that's, you know, that doesn't make sense because that's going to be unequal for men, and it's like a lack of understanding about what feminist principles are. And then the last one is to fund women-led environmental advocacy and climate action. So we've got some organizations like Wella that have been set up to help with that, but we need much more of that happening, because women do have really great ideas, but they don't tend to get it funded. And I just reflect on the fact that we are in the middle of the Women's World Cup soccer, and how now there's been an announcement of $200 million for women's sport. And it's quite interesting how these things come about, because we know we should be doing this, but because the spotlight's on us, we're doing it now, and it's a really great announceable. But really that's what we need to do day in, day out, is really fund this work, because we can talk, but until we have funding and the resources set aside, it's not going to happen. So if we do all those things, I think we'll be able to tackle both the climate and gender crisis, and we'll have a bit more racial justice as well. So there you go. So that's my presentation. And Vandana Shiva, who I really admire, said, we are either going to have a future where women lead the way to make peace with the earth, or we are not going to have a human future at all. And I think I really do feel that. And I don't apologise for saying that when there are men in the room either. I think men have led us into pretty much disaster since the Industrial Revolution and before then, and it's probably time for women to have a go. Thank you.
Sue, that's brilliant.
All right, so any questions, time for discussion, because I know you probably know all this stuff anyway, but I'm happy to share my experiences and the work that I've been doing, and it's come a long way. Like 20 years ago, people weren't really talking about this, but now gender justice within the climate change work is really prominent.
Brilliant. That's really you've put everything together really well, Charlotte, and I love your you're trying to bring in your experience, you know, your lived experience of what you've been doing. You touched on the women's versus feminist principles. Did you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think quite often, and that's why when I worked at Oxfam, it was quite interesting. There was a bit of pushback even from women in the organisation about, you know, what do you mean by feminist principles? It's this idea that it means women's principles, but actually it's all the things that are on the slide around, you know, rejecting traditional leadership, you know, being authentic, caring for yourself and others, taking a strength-based approach. So when you first think about feminist principles, you think about women, but actually it's just a different way of thinking altogether. So maybe, you know, in some organizations talking about it in terms of feminist principles may not be helpful, but I think in the long run it certainly is. I mean, it's interesting, in the last few years I've noticed people talking a lot more about mental health, being more open, being more authentic. In sport, we're seeing that where people, you know, are talking about mental health issues that they're having, you know, more openness around sexual violence, talking about that. Those are all feminist ways of thinking, you know, being challenging, you know, the assumptions around what we're doing and the inequalities. So yeah, have a look up. I don't know, Zonta, if you have your own feminist principles, but they're certainly not just owned by one organization. They can be adapted for any organization.
Excellent.
Yeah.
More questions?
Hold on. Yes, me. Sorry, I'm trying to raise my hand. So Charlotte, mine is a bit of a comment and a question. So
Yeah.
I've known you the last few years in your role as Yarra Riverkeeper.
Yeah.
And that's a huge job because it's the length, really the length of the Yarra River, and it involves working with a huge number of different groups. And what I've seen over the time that I've known you is that you've done an amazing job of actually getting so many of those groups together who were, and there was actually, I have to tell you, there was quite a lot of conflict and gradually Charlotte has actually been able to kind of get on top of some of that conflict, and I think you've just done an amazing job from what I've seen there, getting organisations to work together and getting highly respected within some of those organisations. But you've made the change to the Yarra River, which, I mean, do you think people understand how important a river or a source of water, the environment around the Yarra is? Like, people seem to take so much of this environment for granted, and I see it all the time. And I think, well, this is really primary to your life.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I think, I mean, the organisation's been around nearly 20 years and made some really good strides forward in terms of policy. I mean, the Birrarung is the only river in Australia that has legislation that protects and acknowledge it as a living entity. And there's a whole movement around rights of rivers around the world and rights of nature. And, you know, some rivers around the world have been given legal personhood, which helps you be able to sue people who, you know, or organisations or even states and countries when they pollute the waters. But yeah, I think you're right. I probably underestimated it as well myself coming into the role, that people just do take our natural resources for granted. And the reason I was attracted to the role is because I've worked in about 25 countries globally on climate change, and I'm always dipping in and out of issues where this was my chance to really get really into the detail of it. And it is really complicated. There's so many stakeholders. It's its own case study in complex governance, an ecosystem, a system-based problem in itself. So even if you just looked at it from a climate change perspective, it's really, really complicated. So yeah, I mean, part of our work is to really educate people and just make people aware of that. I think paradoxically for the river, we get 70% of our water, our drinking water, our potable water from the river. And because it's so clean and hardly, you know, it is like the best water that I've ever tasted in about 50 countries that I've traveled to. We kind of go, oh, so everything's fine because we have really great water. But the reality is we've dammed the river, we've reduced its her flow by about 50%. So we've, you know, kept the good stuff for ourselves and then let, you know, the dregs go back to the river, which has really affected the health of the river and all of the animals and plants that really depend on her. So we're really trying to educate people about that the whole ecosystem matters. We haven't talked so much about climate change in the first year and a half, but it's obviously something I'm really keen to talk about. And we've talked about it a lot, but there hasn't been enough research done on the river in terms of climate change. We know that 80% of all impacts that are climate related are water related. So we ignore this at our peril. Just going back to what you said about leadership, I mean, the research has shown that women are more innovative and also adopt preventative measures at a much faster rate than men in terms of looking after the environment. And a review of around 20 studies from around the world found that the presence of women in conservation and natural resource management resulted in stricter and more sustainable rules, greater compliance, more transparency and accountability, and better conflict resolution. So maybe I'm doing my little bit for that as well. So it's just like a different way of going about it. I mean, I think this idea of bringing people together and collaborating, and this idea of collective impact seems really simple, but it's very powerful. But it's amazing how often it doesn't happen. Like, we work with lots of government agencies and they're all part of one government, right? But many of them are in competition with each other. The way we've set up our local councils means that they don't work to support the river, because they're all divided up into their own little patch. So governance really matters. So I think when women are in governance positions, they tend to think of the whole rather than themselves or individuals, which means, you know, the public good or the nature's good, it comes out on top.
I see that Jackie's got her hand up. Jackie, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Charlotte, for your presentation. You mentioned, and we're well aware, that obviously the poor and the marginalised people are suffering more, women are suffering more from the impact of the climate crisis. You've worked extensively in 25 countries, you said, on this problem. I'm just wondering if you have any examples where you've managed to have a big impact on people like us, the people that aren't going to be as impacted as quickly as the other group, to get us behind, get us really motivated and working together towards action.
Yeah, I think it's always hard to kind of think about attribution and you know, where you're having your impact, especially when you're trying to build social movements. So I've been involved professionally in lots of social movements around climate change, but also in my personal life before I became the Riverkeeper, mainly around state and federal elections. I was quite involved in the Stop Adani campaign, and it is about fortunately and unfortunately, it is about individual conversations that build the movement, and it takes a long time. And I do worry that we're running out of time, or we've run out of time for climate. In terms of climate, I think we're locked in some pretty serious impacts already, and we're seeing some of the tipping points being reached. But yeah, I'm very hopeful. And I think what's interesting is a lot of the people that I've worked and grown up with working on climate change, I now see them, including myself, in positions of power and decision making. So that will take some time to kind of roll out, but you are starting to see that, and you are starting to see, you know, a lot more women in positions of power. Obviously, we had Jacinta Ardern most recently, and a different type of leadership as a result of that. And it was interesting, you know, with her resignation, that she talked about this job being too not friendly enough, you know, to have family and have a life. And that kind of just shows you how far wrong we've gone in terms of how we organize ourselves, how we govern ourselves. So I think the climate crisis really provides that opportunity for us to really change things up. And you do need a crisis to be able to do that. When I worked in Vanuatu, they had the biggest cyclone on record, Cyclone Pam, which was quite some time ago now. But that revolutionized the way that government organized itself, and they changed the way they govern. Now, having said that, they still don't have any female, well, last time I checked, they don't have any female parliamentarians. So I think educating women and educating girls and women and getting women into positions of power is really where it's at. So, and that means for me in my job, trying to get more women involved in natural resource management, in advocacy. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to build the capacity of local organisations and local leaders, including women, to be able to do that. It's still a bit ad hoc because we're very small, but yeah, I think the grassroots stuff is still where it's at. You've got to work at top down, but also bottom up, and join those levels together.
Great, thank you.
We've got a comment in the chat line. Pamela Sloss says, thank you, Charlotte. In remote communities here or overseas, have you found local women form their own leadership groups and to have a representative communicate key concerns of the women in their area to the male leaders?
Yes. So some are formal and some informal. I'll talk a bit more about the Pacific, and I mean Melanesia. I haven't really worked in Polynesia or Micronesia, but they do have, they're obviously religious as well. So they do have women's groups in the Pacific, and women leaders. So what's always good to do is not set up new governance structures when you move or when you're working with communities, because those governance structures will tend to only be around as long as the program's funded. So you try and work with existing governance structures. So in the Pacific, we've worked with lots of women's groups, and then work with them to make sure they have representation on the larger groups. And I'd say that was kind of happening anyway, but it's more around making sure there's more equal decision-making power, and then providing opportunities for women to shine and to lead, to actually change the way men view them, and then change the gender roles. So disaster risk reduction committees, or climate and disaster risk reduction committees, are a really good way of doing that. What they found is that women were really, really good at managing finances and making sure they tend to be less corrupt. Then they also tend to identify things that are really good for the public good. The only issue with that is that it can add to women's burden. So you have to work at all levels with that. I have had situations where we've had female leaders still experience domestic violence at home, even though they have been, you know, on a more public level, very vocal. So you have to work at the household level as well. You can't just work at the local community level. You have to work with households. And so it's not just about working with women. I think it's recognised now that you have to work with men and women together, so that they grow together, rather than men feeling like women are being privileged over them. That's really important, but it takes a long time.
I think it all depends on building the trust, isn't it? So
yeah, that's right. I mean, I did maybe I'll send the link. I did some work with CARE in the Pacific, and helped them. Well, I did 5 pieces of work, but it was all really around some gender and resilience research, and we looked at, you know, how you best do that and come up with a bit of a framework. So that's really helpful, because, you know, and it's probably advanced since then as well. Oxfam has done a lot of work on what they call gender transformation, so focus on climate change as well. So that it's an evolving field of work, but super fascinating and interesting. I've dipped out of it a bit in the last couple of years, though.
yeah, that's fine. Well, Sue, I'm going to hand over to, is there any other questions from anyone else before we close up the discussion? Just make sure, no hands raised. That's good.
So Charlotte, you said, oh, we might know some of this, some of it, yes. But the thing is that you brought it all together for us, because we have little bits of knowledge. And one of the things I have to say is that when people say to me, oh, you know, you're in a women's climate action group, like, what are you going to do? What can you do? And you've given us the vision really clearly there. It's not just about, you know, picking things up off the beach, which is always important, but it's about that long-term thinking. It's about that building relationships, building coherence, working out what actual skills we have to contribute, and whether we're here or in another part of the world. And I think with Zonta says now going international, it's really important for us to have that coherence around us. So I think we really appreciate that today. And your experience is incredible, and I think we're very lucky to have you on board as somebody who's involved in climate, in gender, in the Yarra River. Yeah, amazing woman. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, there's a few bits and pieces on. I don't really do consultancy work anymore. I do occasionally when something comes up, it's really interesting. But on my climate concern website, and there's a bunch of stuff on there that some of it's climate and gender related. I just put a couple of things up there. But yeah, it's an evolving field. I think like the number one takeaways is for me is that you have to get women in positions of power and decision making inside governance. Governance is like the key to everything. So if you can get that right, then the rest kind of flows. It's not about getting into the minutiae of training women in this and that. That's helpful, but actually the best thing you can do is to get women in those positions of power, because that's good enough. Because if you get the women in those positions of power, they make better decisions anyway in general. Sorry, men, but that is borne by the evidence. So yeah, for me, working locally, making sure there's good representation, every time we do a talk, making sure that there's equal, if not more, representation of women or First Nations people on panels or on speakers, and just being aware of all that stuff and providing that equity. A voice is really important, and that's why the voice to Parliament is really important as well, because we're not asking for very much, but just by having more voices at the table, we'll get better decisions made. But if you don't have that diversity, you don't get that good discussion and those good decisions come out of it. Yeah,
exactly. While you're here, I would just want to remind everybody about the Women Taking Climate Action Scholarship, which is $1,000, but more importantly, it is recognition of a woman who's involved in climate action in some way, which can be quite diverse. So people have been sent information, but if you need it again, please contact me. We close on August the 25th, but if somebody wants to make a case for waiting a few more days because they've got somebody who can't do it before then, I'm open to discussion. So Charlotte, we want to take that back to your organisation. I know you've been sent.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, that's lovely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for your talk today, and thank you, Suzanne, for introducing and wrapping up with Charlotte's discussion. And the links there I'll share as well on the when we do an email after the event, so everyone's got those. They look really great. Thank you, Charlotte. That's super. I'm sure we'll be in touch again.
No worries. All right. Have a lovely rest of the meeting.
Network of people. It's wonderful. We're all got to collaborate, and if we can help you in any way, just let us know. We've got to have this wonder web, of women that can actually make a difference. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I was going to mention, are you aware of the Women's Climate Congress?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Congress, yes, it's very good. They cover quite a lot of different angles, and the different webinars they have. It's been very interesting.
Yeah. No, it's good. Okay, lovely. All right, well, enjoy, and feel free to contact me if you need any assistance, and I'll do my best.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Bye.